Hello guys, and welcome back to HJW Gaming and another Age of Empires mobile guide. In this video we're going to be taking a look at all the available civilizations and talking through which I think are best and for what stages in your season you should look to pick those up. If you find this guide informative and helpful, please hit the like button, I'd massively appreciate it, and consider subscribing to see more of my Age of Empires videos in the future. Without further ado, into the guide. Now, the first civilization available are the Chinese. Their combat speciality here is archer's defense, so this is useful, of course, if you plan on using an archery formation as your main team. Particularly early season, this can be very valuable, as you do have commanders like Hua Mulan and Attila the Hun available in some of the earliest events, along with, of course, the starting commander Josephine also being synergistic with the archery unit speciality as well. So this isn't the worst buff in the world and actually can be quite useful, as that increased defense will also prevent you from losing too many units whilst you're committing actions with this army. So they do synergize well, particularly in early season. And continuing on that vein, you also have an increased villager capacity as the second buff here from the Chinese. Now this is massively important at the beginning. Increased villagers means you'll be able to do or gain more resources through your keep passively over time by allocating them to the various different resource buildings within your citadel. So this can be one of the best choices for early game civilizations, picking the Chinese. The only slight downside is the wall durability. This is next to pointless in my opinion, as if your opponent has defeated your defending armies and is already sieging the keep, the durability is only going to buy you a tiny bit of time. It's not actually going to provide any additional defense. So in my opinion, it's not particularly great. However, the first two buffs are two of the best available for starting civilizations. Second up, we have the French civilization. Now their military kind of buff is cavalry defense, and similar to the archer one, this is only really a choice that you yourself can make. It depends on which troops and commanders and heroes you plan on using. However, what I would say is particularly early game, cavalry heroes do seem to be somewhat underpowered, and they're not particularly helped currently by the meta being, particularly early game, being strong pikeman formations with commanders like Leonidas available in early game events, along with Richard I. And then you also have even commanders like Joan of Arc and Frederick that are available very early on. Joan of Arc, of course, being one of the beginner starting commanders. So cavalry heroes do fall a little bit short in the power department, as they are countered by some of the strongest early game heroes. So in my opinion, this is a little bit weak, particularly in the early game. But if you're looking to use primary cavalry marches in the future, when some of the better commanders come out, then definitely consider picking up the French if you're looking to use them. However, that being said, their other buffs aren't particularly the best. You do have a 5% increased resource exchange rate. Now this isn't particularly great in my opinion, as the availability, particularly early season, of resource chests leads to the exchange rate being fairly null and void. I can't say I've used my exchange particularly often, sometimes only to get an exchange to get that tiny little 10% buff that you get by swapping one resource for another at a discount. Other than that, I can't say I found it particularly impactful, as I get so many chests just through engaging in events in the game, so I've never really needed to use it. Similar effects gathering troops defense. Now, if you're in a server where the opponents and other keeps around you are particularly aggressive with destroying your armies whilst they gather on tiles, then potentially this could be useful. But in my particular server, I am yet to see this have any effect. I don't think I've been attacked once while gathering, and I usually have 4 sets of armies out gathering all at once. So in my opinion, the gathering troops defense is also pretty null and void. In my opinion, this makes the French one of the weakest civilizations available, and particularly not great for early season players, so I personally wouldn't recommend using these unless you're desperate for that cavalry defense buff. Third, we have the Byzantines. Hopefully I've pronounced that correctly. Now, their buff is for swordsman defense. In my opinion, again, this is another great one for early game, and particularly throughout, as there are some great swordsman marches available no matter what your spend level. At free-to-play, there are some brilliant early game marches using Josephine, King Derek and Hammurabi all being free-to-play heroes, so you could look to take up the Byzantines and make use of this synergy. Similarly, if you're a mid or high spender, there is also Tribuana and Miyamoto as well available for those willing to spend money, so there is a varying level of both good free-to-play and very good mid to high spend troop available, which synergizes well with swordsman defense. Similarly, swordsmen in the early game do counter against pikemen, and pikemen's another one of the most popular early game troop types due to the availability of Leonidas. So therefore, swordsman defense buff, in my opinion, is very welcomed. Now, the second buff available via the Byzantines is siege damage increased by 5%. In my opinion, this isn't a great buff, as when you're hitting opponents' keeps, you could just siege for that little bit longer. It's not going to save you a huge amount of time. And if you're at rallies and things with your fellowship, it might get you a tiny bit more rewards, but it's not really going to come in that clutch, in my opinion, so I don't think this is a particularly great buff. However, stone gathering speed in the world being the third buff, I think this is can be very useful, as when you're gathering, when you're not active in your game, you're going to be trying to get as much resource in as possible. So an increased gathering speed can always be useful in getting that little bit extra resource in your keep. It's not going to be massively impactful, but it is still a useful skill. It's not as useless, of course, in my opinion, as the siege damage. So Byzantines, kind of middle of the road here. Useful particularly for combat with that swordsman defense, but of course, again, only if you're using swordsman formations you might choose otherwise, and therefore Byzantines will be useless to you. But kind of middle of the road. Some good, some bad. Next up we have the Romans. Now, their military speciality is going to be popular, with it being the pikemen. As I've said multiple times, pikemen are particularly popular throughout the game, particularly early game with Leonidas being available, but also in late game, as they do have some fantastic armies available that utilise the counter-attacking dynamic within their speciality. So this will be a popular one, particularly for those looking for PvP combat and using those pikeman formations. But again, if you're not using pikemen, it's completely pointless to you, so judge it based on whichever your own armies you're looking to use are. Now, the second buff sounds a lot better than it is, in my opinion. The second buff is to healing speed, increasing it by 5%. Particularly early game, healing speeds are incredibly short, so cutting 5% off it is going to do not a huge amount. Potentially really late game this could be beneficial, but with speed ups always available, in my opinion, this isn't a hugely significant buff, and healing, in my opinion, has yet to really hold me back, so I don't see this being the best buff available. Similarly, villagers' boost to building production is very small, only giving plus 30. Now, you're not going to be relying too much on your villagers' production, particularly early game, as you're instead going to be looking to gather from the overworld. Unless you're potentially on a server where, as I said earlier, opponents are attacking your gathering commanders, then maybe some production in your keep could be useful, but I just don't see that being the reality. So in my opinion, I think gathering will always be stronger than in Citadel production, and therefore this villagers' boost to buildings production, I think is fairly poor. So in my opinion, whilst Romans look brilliant on paper, I don't think they're a great choice, be it picking at the start of a server in particular, but also not great towards the end either. So I would definitely avoid the Romans unless you're looking for that pikeman defense buff. The fifth option available to you is the British. Now, of course, I really would love to give this a glowing review, being British myself, but we'll talk through it based on its merits. So we have Archer Defense up first, once again, similar to that of the Chinese. I'm not going to run through and talk through this a second time. Skip back to the Chinese bit if you want me to cover again why Archer Defense can be very strong. But the second buff available here is Player Citadel Defense Bonus. Now, this is going to be an incredibly situational choice. If you're potentially in an underdog fellowship, or you're located in a place where you're getting attacked regularly, then this 10% defense buff could be very useful. However, if you're on an aggressive and front-footed fellowship that are looking to dominate the map, this is going to be near pointless to you, as you're going to be moving forwards all the time, being the ones doing the attacking rather than the ones being attacked. So this defense bonus will basically go completely unused. So this could be great, could be terrible. Very much depends on your situation within the game at the time. And then this production of mills being increased by 5%. I actually think this is very similar to what I said about the villagers boost for the Romans, in that you're not really going to be relying on resources coming from your keep unless you're unable to gather, so I don't think this is a particularly great buff either. So unfortunately, I'm actually going to say that I think the British is fairly poor. If you are looking for the only really useful buff, in my opinion, here is the archer defense, I would go for the Chinese, unless you're being attacked regularly and you need that citadel defense bonus. Next up, we have the Egyptian civilization. Now, they share the pikeman defense buff with the Roman civilization, so again I won't repeat that. But their other two buffs are, first up, you have a troop load increased by 5%. Now, this will really depend on where you are within your season. If you're regularly pillaging or plundering opponents or other players' citadels for their resources, this could be very useful. But this is more of a mid to late game buff. Early game, it's very unlikely that the troop load that you get from that you have on your commanders is less than that you have in your war hall as your total plunderable limit. At least that's what I've found. I found that I can usually just send one army out to plunder. They'll get that maximum amount of resource that I have available for the day. Then they'll come back. And that's therefore at my limit, so I haven't had to increase troop load as of yet. However, if you're late game and your war hall is extremely high level and you're having several plunders going out in order to achieve that daily resource benefit, in this case 5% more could be useful for limiting the amount of additional marches you have to send out. I think a lot of people confuse this troop load kind of with that daily gathering limit, daily war hall plundering limit. So it's only increasing the amount of resources your troops can carry all at one time. It's not increasing the maximum amount that you're allowed to take per day, limited by the game. So this is a fairly average buff in my opinion. I don't think it's particularly great. Particularly early season, it's useless, but maybe late season it could come into effect. Though in my opinion, it's not as useless as the third skill here with the Egyptians, which is gathering troop unit loss prevention. As I've said previously, it doesn't happen particularly often where others try and plunder you whilst you're gathering on a resource tile. In some particularly aggressive servers it might happen, but in the vast majority that's not going to happen, particularly early game. So in my opinion, both these buffs are pretty useless, and I would therefore not pick the Egyptians. Which then leads, I suppose, to an interesting question between Egyptians and Romans. If you're using pikemen and want pikemen defense, which of the two would I pick? Because I've kind of said both are pretty poor. In my opinion, I think if you had to pick between the two, I would probably pick the Romans if you're engaging in a lot of PvP, because at least you get a little benefit from that increased production and that increased healing speed. Whereas I do think that troop load and gathering buff is significantly worse than both. So if you have to pick one with pikeman defense, because you're maining a pikeman team, I would pick the Romans. So Egyptians, yeah, definitely one of the ones I would choose to avoid. Next, we have the Japanese. Now, the Japanese actually have some very strong buffs here. The first they have military-wise, they have swordsman defense, and I spoke earlier of why I think swordsman defense is so good, particularly in early game. And similarly synergizing with early game is actually the third ability with the Japanese, which increases your attack against tribes in the world by 10%. Now, in early game, you are going to be able to keep up, I think, with level of the tribes a lot of the time and not lose too many units. However, this additional attack bonus will make sure that you minimise that number of troops that you lose in battles against these tribes, particularly when that's what you're probably going to be using pretty much all of your stamina on, particularly during events that require it, such as Giant's Roar. So if you can minimise that number of losses, you spend less resource on dying troops, and therefore more resource on your growing. So I think this is quite a strong, particularly early game skill, which synergises well with me saying that swordsman defense, in my opinion, is particularly good for early game as well. So if you are trying to pick an early season civilization, I think the Japanese could be very, very strong. I think they probably come in just behind the Chinese, as those additional villagers are more useful, particularly for early gathering, within Citadel gathering. But yeah, I do think the Japanese do hold a place in the kind of early game meta, probably as the second best civilization available. And that swordsman buff, of course, as well. If you're planning on maining, particularly early game, a swordsman team, potentially the Japanese could even become your first choice. Now, I haven't spoken much about their second buff. This is actually another fantastic buff. This gives you an attack bonus against players' citadels. So if you're engaging in regular PvP, you get a plus 5% buff when you're attacking another player's citadel. This is another fantastic skill, as in early game you're often probably going to want to siege opponents' keeps so you can get that daily resource flowing in line with the level of your war hall. So you'll take significantly less losses as you have this 5% bonus attack. And in late game, when you're engaged in a lot of significant fellowship PvP, again, this is going to be really useful in making sure that you can deal the maximum amount of damage. So in my opinion, the Japanese is possibly one of the best civilizations available throughout the game. Now last, and by no means least, we have the Koreans. Now, the Koreans' military buff is cavalry. As I've said earlier, I think cavalry are probably in the weakest spot amongst the meta of the 4 different types. However, late game, there are some great cavalry marches that you can get going. So this could still be very useful. Just early game, I do think the Koreans are a little bit underpowered. However, as I said, late game, you do get some fantastic buffs that synergize with the Koreans. And this one here is the second skill with increased looting limit by 500k. I've spoken multiple times in this video about attacking other players' citadels, taking their resources and bring them back. The ability to take an additional 500k every single day. Now this will stack day on day on day. Obviously 500k additional every single day. That's a huge amount of additional resource that you can take from opponents. Think about it as a free-to-play player. That's a lot of money you save by getting an additional 500k taken from other people. Sometimes they might even be buying resource packs themselves and then you're putting that resource and bringing it home to yourself. Think about it that way. That can be a brilliant buff. So in my opinion, looting limit, that is an excellent buff. And similarly, if you're attacking a lot of people, there's a high chance people are going to start attacking you back. And with that, you get an additional 10% resource storage protection rate. Now, of course, this one's going to be kind of dependent on how often you are getting attacked. But if you're getting attacked back or from attacking other people, this could be very useful. So, of course, it is kind of situational, but can still be very useful. 10% more resources unavailable for other people to plunder. Of course, you can always just reduce this. You reduce your resources down to next to nil before you sign off, and that will then make you less attractive to be plundered. However, if you do have some resources left in your keep, this can keep more of them protected. So Koreans, in my opinion, particularly mid to late game, this could be absolutely brilliant. But there is still kind of a place. There may be mid-tier in early game, and I definitely think they're the best of the 2 cavalry specialised civilizations. Anyway, with that, I've been HJW Gaming. Hopefully I've given you plenty of advice on which civilization to pick and where each one can be appropriate. If you found this useful, please smash the like button and please consider subscribing to see more of my Age of Empires content in the future. And with that, I really hope to see you on the next one.